Okay. This Hangouts is now live. I am 10 minutes-ish or so early, but we happened to be ready. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my Wednesday night, 7:30 p.m. live stream. And today, my guest is Ben Davies of the very famous and very successful Caldron Pool. How are you, Ben?
Don't know about that. Doing well. How you going?
I'm doing really, really well. And before we begin the official subject matter, I just wanted to say something to all the leftists. Because of you, I am I have started to realize how strong my emotional capacity is to love, and that is thanks to my walk with Christ. So anyone watching, I don't hate anyone. I know that that's the narrative at the moment, but I'm actually good, and I'm really happy, and I'm really pleased to have Ben on today. And today's live stream is about answering frequently asked Bible questions, but I probably should have retitled it to questions that I used to be skeptical about, because that's technically what it is. So Ben, you got an email from me, and you've done all the research.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah. Okay. So the very first one is one that many people spout, particularly leftists, particularly gay people and atheists. The question is, does the Bible advocate the murder of gay people? I already know the answer to this, but I've answered this question many times, but I think a seasoned Christian would be better off answering it. So could you answer that?
Okay, yeah, you're right. It is usually an objection to Christianity that's kind of designed to discredit either the Christian or, more importantly, the Bible. And the reason why they use this one in particular is quite simply because it's the social justice fad of the day, gay rights.
Yes.
If we prove the Bible is against gay rights, then we can discredit the Bible, we can discredit Christians, and we can kind of keep them out of politics and out of the public square and whatnot. But I think one of the indications that goes to show that this is more of a dishonest attempt to sort of portray the Bible in a certain way is that if you look in the actual chapter that they're referring to, which is Leviticus 20, verse 13, I'll just read it. It says,
yeah, go ahead.
If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Now, they use this verse to sort of portray Christianity as this anti-human rights sort of faith that's wrong side of history type thing. But what you'll see is that in the exact same chapter, and this is what you don't often hear from them, in the exact same chapter, he's pronounced the same judgment on the heterosexual, sexually immoral acts.
For fornicating, yeah.
Yeah, so in verse 10 in particular, he says the heterosexual act of committing adultery with another man's wife is punishable by death. So you don't often hear people spouting off that one. They'll go to the one about homosexuality because they are jumping on this bandwagon of gay rights right now and trying to present the Bible in a negative light in that sense. Now, the question is, when we have verses like this that talk about those who commit adultery deserving of death, those who commit homosexual acts deserving of death, the question is, how then do Christians deal with that? Now, a lot of people will say, oh, today, yeah, presently. Yeah. A lot of people will say, oh, Christians are just cherry picking from the Bible.
I always hear atheists saying, oh, Christians just cherry pick.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they'll say, you want to say, this is God's standard of morality. Well, why aren't you being consistent and saying we should therefore execute sexually immoral people? So that's the question that Christians have to answer. And Christians have answered, but I think a lot of people who don't want to hear that answer put their fingers in their ears. They don't want to hear how Christians deal with commands in the Old Testament with the new covenant that we're in now. So I think I used it maybe the last time I was on your show, the example of the command given to Noah to go and build an ark.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I recall.
Yeah. So my point there was everyone's generally familiar with the story of Noah's ark, that God came to Noah and said, I'm going to flood the earth, go and build an ark. No one ever will say, well, look, here's a verse in Genesis 6 that says, go and build an ark of gopher wood and put 2 of every animal in it. Why aren't Christians going around building arks? That's the command. The reason why people don't expect that of Christians is because they're familiar with the story. And when they're familiar with the story, they're familiar with the context. No, it was God speaking to Noah at a specific time, in a specific place, to a specific person, not necessarily to Christians. So no one ever holds Christians to that and say, well, if you want to obey the Bible, you have to go and do this thing. The same thing applies for these Old Testament passages in Leviticus and these old laws.
But then they'll say that, oh, you're just, what's the word? They'll say that, you know, there's a word for it. But anyway, it's a cop-out.
Yeah, well, they can say that, but they're wrong, because the same thing would apply if all commands in the Bible are given to all people over all time in all places, then that's the least of our problems. Okay, so anyone who picks up any book knows every sentence, every word has a context, and you need to read it in its context. Who is speaking? Who is the person speaking to? When are they speaking, and when is it supposed to take place? What we're talking about here is the Old Testament laws that were given to the nation of Israel, theocratic nation of Israel, who were given laws that are basically divided up. Theologians have divided them up into 3 categories: the moral laws of God, the ceremonial laws of God, and the civil laws of God. See, Israel was a nation that lived under the rule of God. And as a nation living with each other, they needed to have rules and laws in order to know how they are supposed to interact with each other, the things that are injustices against each other, and how to deal with those things. Now, yes, God has a standard of morality. Yes, God wanted his people of Israel to be sexually moral. He didn't want them committing adultery. He didn't want them going around raping each other. He didn't want them doing homosexuality, because in the Bible, God says that the only context for sex is in a heterosexual marriage. Anything outside of that, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual acts, it's all immoral. That's how God defines it. That's how God defined it to the nation of Israel. If people want to live in the nation of Israel, violate his laws, very often, or in this particular instance, the consequence of that was death. So we aren't the nation of Israel.
No.
We aren't living in that theocratic nation right now. And we're not living under that law either, because that is the old covenant. That's why the Bible's separated into the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. The Old Covenant is what God gave for a specific people at a specific time. Like I was saying with the command to Noah, we know the context. The context for the Old Testament, which these people who object to Christianity seem to really, really struggle to get their heads around, is that the Old Testament was given to specific people for a specific time. That doesn't mean we disregard the Bible any more than we disregard the story of Noah, because those commands weren't given to us. We keep the Old Testament, we read the Old Testament, we learn about God through the Old Testament. But we're in the new covenant. We're under the New Testament, the new covenant which Jesus instituted. That's not to say that everything in the Old Covenant is now irrelevant. The moral law still stands. Murder is still wrong. Stealing is still wrong. And Jesus often talked about sexual immorality in the New Testament. Now, if you opened up your Bible and you heard Jesus talk about sexual immorality, you might ask, well, what does that mean? How do you define what's moral and immoral? Well, for a first century Jew, guess what his standard of sexual immorality was? The Old Testament. He wasn't just talking about sexual immorality up in the air with no definition, no meaning. He got his meaning of what was moral and immoral out of the Old Testament, what God revealed to the nation of Israel. That's what sexual immorality is. That's why Christians today, we say, we don't want to go and round up homosexuals and put them to death.
No.
We're not there under that old covenant. We're in the new covenant, and we haven't been given that command. Israel may have been given that command, and it wasn't just like groups of people going out rioting, dragging people out of their homes and stoning them. This was like a civil government was supposed to enact these things, and anyway, there was a civil government. It wasn't just mob rule, and we're not supposed to be doing that. But that's not to say that God has somehow changed his standard of what is moral and what is immoral in that regard. There's nothing in the New Testament to say that he no longer considers sexual acts outside of a heterosexual marriage as okay or acceptable. The New Testament, in fact, reiterates the fact that any form of sexuality outside of marriage is immoral. So it's consistent in that regard.
I often go.
You go.
I often say to people who say to me, oh, you're a Christian, so you hate gays. I often say, what are you referring to? And they'll always mention Leviticus. And my usual response is, well, how many Christians do you know of right now who are stoning gay people? And then I also say that the Old Testament is Judaic, and that there weren't any Christians back then. So it's irrelevant to us in every sense.
In the sense that we're not obligated to go and do these things. They were. And the problem that the atheists or people who object to Christianity have is that they want to pretend they have this moral standard that is higher than the Bible itself, or
their moral standard changes anyway.
It's subjective. So
yes.
So what is it? Even if I agreed with them, and even if we agreed with them that okay, it's wrong to put sexually immoral people to death in the nation of Israel, even if we agreed that was the case, we need to articulate or be able to articulate what our moral standard is, where it comes from. And most often, the only thing they have is the collective opinion of the people at that time. So they would then have to say that given the right circumstances, it would be moral to stone homosexuals or stone adulterers to death, provided the majority consent and provided the morality of the culture says that's okay. See, if you want to have a morality that's shifting based on personal opinion or collective opinion, then you have to make room for the execution of sexually immoral people to be acceptable, provided the community, provided the consensus says, yes, that's moral. So they really don't have an objection. They really don't. They're basically being inconsistent in holding to this moral standard that is so arbitrary. They can't define themselves. It's not based on anything. And it just can't, practically, it just can't work out. So it's a non-objection. It doesn't stand. Problem is, none of them will want to listen or think that through. Yeah.
Yeah, they'll just cut you off at the source, and
And the other issue is, the Bible is quite clear that every sin is deserving of death.
Absolutely, everything. If you're obese, in the Old Testament, being obese, being gluttonous was deemed extremely sinful.
Yeah, so the New Testament says the wages of sin is death. Adam and Eve ate an apple. They ate
a fruit. It has not been confirmed it was an apple, my friend.
You're correct. But they disobeyed God's command and ate fruit from the tree they were told not to.
And
as a consequence of that, God said, the day you eat it, you will die. Death was the certainty. And people have been dying ever since. Every sin ends up being ending in death. Everyone is on death row. That's
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
point.
We're all on death row. We're all going to end up dead anyway. And the best way to end up dead is to find salvation through Christ.
Yes, and that's the thing. Like, they want to object to the fact that God sentences people to death in the Old Testament. Well, guess what? You're going to face him one day, and you're going to have that death sentence on you.
On Judgment Day.
But the question is, what has he done? What has God done? Because we've obviously got this death sentence on us. What has he done in response to that? He's come into the world and died the death that we deserve to die.
Yeah, it's a very noble sacrifice.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the second question. Is creationism compatible with the modern view of science today? This is usually I watched a debate a couple of years ago when I was really into the subject, and it was Ken Ham versus Bill Nye the Science Guy. And Ken Ham, I don't know, did you watch it?
I did, yes.
Oh, yay! That's funny. I've never met someone else that watched it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, I'm excited. I'm excited that you watched it. Well, yeah, Ken Ham, in my opinion, completely destroyed Bill Nye the Science Guy's argument, except for one thing where Bill Nye the Science Guy said that if any archaeologist scientist found something that proved the Bible, it would be known the world over. Like it would change everything in an instant. The way that science looks at the way that scientists look at the Earth today. If one thing was out of order, everything would be out of whack. So that was something I had to concede that seemed genuine. What are your thoughts on creationism and evolution?
Well, I think the way you've framed the question is very similar to the way militant atheists like to frame the debate when it comes to this sort of stuff. They will usually say it's faith versus science.
They do say that.
They do. And it's religious belief and wishful thinking versus truth and facts and hard knowledge. So they often characterize Christians as believing fairy tales, flying spaghetti monsters.
Usually Christians are stupid, atheists are smart.
Exactly, yes. Christians, you want to be a Christian, you've got to be anti-science. You've got to believe things that are unscientific. But it's that anyone who's engaged in public debate know this is a common tactic that people use to avoid debate. You call your opponent transphobic rather than debating the issue. Homophobic rather than debating the issue. Sexist. He's racist. He's misogynistic. You're
anti-science.
Exactly. So that's what they do. You want to oppose a Christian view of the world, a Christian worldview. Well, you call them anti-science. You pretend that the facts are against them. But I would argue that it's the reverse. The facts are actually against the atheist. I would say it's the atheist here who is anti-science, and it's the atheist who subscribes to a blind faith. Because you take a step back, you look at what we're doing when we do science is examining what we've got in front of us, testing what we've got in front of us. Take a step back and consider the presuppositions that are behind that approach. The atheist will presuppose that his own thoughts can bring him to a knowledge of the truth. But you ask an atheist why he thinks that the thinking thoughts in his mind are an accurate reflection on ultimate reality. He has no reason to give you. He has no.
That's really smart. That's a good argument. Keep going.
Well, that I can't take credit for that. That was C.S. Lewis who said if atheism is true, he said, then my own thoughts are the product of a long chain of accidents and chemical reactions. So my thinking is therefore a product of accidents. How can I then think my thinking is accurate or trust my thinking is true? An atheist doesn't know if he's thinking true thoughts or experiencing the sensation of thinking true thoughts.
True.
for the gorilla, he has a worldview. The gorilla knows, what's up. Stick a stick in here and the ants crawl on it and you eat it off it. Every thinking creature has a worldview. So who's to say that the atheist has any greater grapple on ultimate reality?
They don't.
Than any of the other animals, than any of
Yeah.
the lesser evolved creatures. That's the first.
That's the first point.
That they can't trust their own thinking. They have no basis. They can't even verify it. You got to verify that your thoughts are true by thinking. So it's completely circular. Secondly, the laws of logic. You need the laws of logic. You need to apply logical thought in order to do science. If things changed and everything was absurd and irrational, you can't do science. But what are the laws of logic? They don't fit into an atheistic, materialistic, purely physical universe because they're abstract. They're universal. They're concepts that govern how physical things move. They take that for granted. They take the laws of logic and reasoning in that sense for granted. They also take for granted the fact that nature is uniform. Everything in Australia, scientifically, is going to be uniform with science in the United States, science in Canada. You don't travel to a different part of the world and find nature acts completely contrary to what it does where you are from. So they assume nature is uniform. Now, let's just be generous and say that humans have an entire 1% of all knowledge in the universe. What's to say in that 99% of knowledge they don't have, there are things out there that contradict what they think they know, that prove them entirely wrong. So to say that nature is uniform and to operate and to perform science on the assumption that all nature is uniform with only 1% of knowledge, well, who's to say that what you think you know somewhere else in the universe is completely opposite? You don't know. They don't have all knowledge, so they can't. This is another presupposition that they have. The fourth one is morality, absolute morality. They take that for granted as well. They have absolutely no
They have no objective morality.
Yeah, it cannot fit in an atheist worldview. I don't think there are many atheists out there who actually thought about atheism long enough to consider the implications of what they're actually saying.
Maybe not. Maybe not with the things you're claiming and stating, because people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, I'm sure they thought about it. They spent years thinking about it. They spent years lecturing about not believing in something. How ironic does that sound?
I don't even know about that, because Jonathan Safadi has a great quote, which I put in an article that I wrote called Proof of Christianity is the Absurdity of the Contrary, which is basically saying atheism is an absurd alternative to Christianity.
Well, it is. It's an ideology.
It is. And what he says is, we wonder why atheists call themselves free thinkers if they believe thoughts are merely the results of atomic motion in the brain obeying the fixed laws of chemistry. See, the atheist thinks all that exists is just stuff, matter, physical chemicals just reacting to each other. Now, if we are just the product of chemical reactions and we're just one chemical bursting over here and one chemical bursting over there, and then this one responding to this one, where do you put morality in that? Now, an example that Pastor Doug Wilson has used is get 2 soft drinks, shake them up, and they fizz. Take the lid off, they fizz. Can you say one of those soft drinks fizzed morally and one fizzed immorally? How do you get 2 soft drinks to fizz morally or immorally? It's completely irrelevant. The moral question of chemical reaction is utterly irrelevant. Yet somehow they're trying to work morality into a world where it's purely dominoes, where what's going to happen is going to happen regardless of whether you believe it, whether he thinks it's true, whether you convince that guy. And yet you have people like Richard Dawkins who are on Twitter trying to change people's mind. Well, what's going to be is going to be, because we live in a cause and effect physical universe. where you can't, your thoughts are merely the chemical reaction to other chemical reactions.
It's funny. What is Richard Dawkins? If there was no God, what is he battling against? What is the spiritual struggle he's having? And what is the spiritual struggle all of these atheists are having with trying to prove so hard their worldview? I mean, that in itself, to me, seems like a strange premise. Why focus so much of your time and life trying to say that there is nothing? Clearly, there's a spiritual struggle going on in there.
The consistent atheist is the nihilist who throws up his hands and says, there is no meaning, nothing matters. That's where atheism takes a person.
Yeah.
Ultimately nothing matters.
Well, then let's all go out and murder people.
There is nothing that could, basically, they don't even know if they're a brain in a laboratory being prodded and injected with thoughts and experiences. That's what atheists are reduced to. You're locked inside your own brain and you don't even know your own thoughts are true.
Yeah.
But the thing is, no one really is an atheist.
No, they just think they are. But see, that sounds like we're insulting them. It's like, oh,
I'm happy to, because Romans 1 says,
I get enough hate as it is.
they can put it on me. That's fine. Romans 1 says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen in the things that he has made, so that everyone's without excuse. What he's saying is, if you're walking in the bush and you see a drawing in the sand, a love heart, you don't go, isn't it funny how, nature did that? You walk on and you see the love heart and you see someone's initials. You don't go, oh, look, it looks like nature's forming, a message. You walk on further. That's
what he says. That's what Lee Strobel says.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I haven't read him. So there you go.
Sorry, keep going.
So you keep going, and then there's the Mona Lisa painted. What level of stupidity do you look at the Mona Lisa and say, isn't it amazing? Isn't nature amazing? How it's constructed this piece of beauty. Everyone knows where there is intention, where there is design, where there is purpose, it's preceded by an artist, by someone writing the message.
Everything has a creator. Everything has
exactly
purpose. I agree with you.
And that is amplified when the message is more detailed and more complex. There's the love heart. There's the love heart with the message. There's the Mona Lisa. It intensifies as the detail increases. You look at the infinite detail of the universe compared to the limited detail of a bricked house. And you look at the house and you say, someone must have built that. Someone must have built the pyramids. Someone must have built this and this and this. But when you come to the universe, you take your brain out and you say, oh, it spontaneously appeared when nothing exploded.
Yeah.
No one believes that. They'll say they do. They don't. Everybody knows God. And they hate him.
Well, I think there are atheists who are intellectually sincere, of course. But I do believe many have come to the conclusion that there is no God. But at the end of the day, the Bible does say in some verse somewhere that everyone actually does know.
Yeah, Romans 1.
Romans 1, is it?
Romans 1. Everyone is without excuse because there's enough information in the things God has made. Just in looking at the world, there's enough there to tell you about the God who made it. Just as I said, you couldn't hold up any painting and say it spontaneously appeared in my living room and convince anyone in their right mind that took place. How can you open your window and say, look at the sunset, it spontaneously appeared?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. All right, well, let's move on to... We didn't actually answer the question, though, did we? We sort of ranted more about atheists.
Well, I did have another good quote from Rodney Stark.
Sure.
He said, the Christian concept of God held the key to the rise of the West. The belief in a rational creator God had the implication that the creation itself was rational and obeyed rules. Science only happened in the West because only in the West was science plausible. Elsewhere, it was thought that the universe was eternal and that it was mystical, and that that it was beyond understanding and human comprehension. We could meditate on it, but we couldn't discover the rules that made it work. So he's saying it is the Christian worldview that made science possible. It was a way of...
That made our society great.
Well, theology is the study of God, but science is the study of what he's created
done.
here on this earth.
That's a great way to put it. Very true. Okay, let's move on to the next question because we have a few to go through. This is my favorite question, actually. It's the third one, and it's the rabbit hole I've fallen down in the last couple of weeks, months, actually. Yep. Yeah, I know you know. So who do you think are the sons of God? In Genesis, it is quoted the sons of God. I recently interviewed Tim Alberino, who is an acquaintance and friend and associate of Stephen Quayle, who is the foremost authority on this subject, the Nephilim. But what do you personally think it is? How do you answer the question of who are the sons of God?
Did you want me to read the verse just so people...
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, good idea.
So Genesis 6:1 is where it comes from. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, the daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives as they chose. So the question here is, who are the sons of God taking the daughters of man to be their wife? This is right before the flood, just before God destroys...
Which technically, for those who are not aware, the terminology is antediluvian.
Well done, yes.
Thank you.
So some scholars will say at this time there's two main family groups that the Bible is focused on. There's Cain and his descendants. There's Seth and his descendants. So they will argue that the sons of God in this instance are most likely the righteous descendants of Seth, who are now marrying with the unrighteous descendants of Cain, and Cain was the one who murdered his brother. That's the safer option that some scholars take. To try to keep it less bizarre.
Conspiracy theorist.
Yeah. The other view is that the sons of God in this instance are angelic beings or heavenly beings, something outside of this world.
Yes.
I would subscribe to that more than the other, mostly due to Peter and Jude. It seemed to be how they understood Genesis. Peter in 2 Peter 2 says, if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness and to be kept until judgment, if he did not...
Where did you read that?
2 Peter 2:4.
Oh, okay. I didn't know there was any more biblical references about it. I thought it was all extra biblical. Yeah.
No. So he says God punishes these angels who didn't keep their place, and then he didn't spare the ancient world, but only preserved Noah. Jude also says the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. It seems like Peter and Jude are understanding that passage in Genesis 6 in that way, maybe in light of the Book of Enoch or whatever the Book of Enoch looked like at that time, because Jude goes on to quote from the Book of Enoch. I would be careful when it comes to the Book of Enoch, which goes into detail about these angelic beings and names them all and goes and details the entire account of how
it does, as does the Book of Giants.
Yeah. The only reason I'll be careful with it is because we just don't know. The only thing we can be certain about is what God has revealed to us in the scriptures. That is
well, the Book of Enoch was once 500 years ago included in the Bible, but then for whatever reason it was excluded, and many people say that was done intentionally because there was an agenda, and that the Catholics, which is a corrupt church, had an agenda, and they were working with, I don't know if it's like Illuminati crap, I don't know, but that they were working together, and they're like, this reveals too much. We need to take the Book of Enoch out and make it less accessible, because we can't have people knowing whatever it was that people knew. I don't know what you think about that, but that's sort of the claim.
Some people did think it was part of the canon.
It was, and it still is in Ethiopia.
Yeah, and it only exists in the Ethiopic language now. We don't have any ancient Greek manuscripts of it or anything like that. So the best we can do is to say we know some of it's true, meaning Jude quotes from it. Jude quotes a portion from it. We know at least that portion is true. Whether he had his hands on something similar to what we have today, no one knows. So we can't really put all our faith in that. It is interesting. I've read it a few times. It is
so interesting.
It is, yeah. But when it comes to this topic, there are a lot of unanswered questions that I don't think we'll have answered this side of eternity. Moses, when writing Genesis 6, seemed to speak as though the people kind of knew what he was referring to. He didn't go into a lot of detail, which is why we aren't too sure.
That's well, the Bible's designed to be ambiguous, I suppose, with certain things.
So, yeah, we can't put a lot of faith in it, just because we just don't know. And there's also the fact that if it was inspired, if God intended on it being part of the canon, God is sovereign. He's in control of everything. He would have preserved it better for us, rather than go 2,000 years with the church not having any access to it.
Yeah.
It also assumes that Noah took the book onto the ark. So.
Well, Noah is a direct relative of Enoch, so it could just be an oral history that was passed along.
It could have, yeah. It was his great-granddad, so.
So this question is somewhat related to the previous, and it is, when the Bible refers to Noah not being corrupted, does that mean through sin or through genetics? Because Stephen Quayle and Tim Alberino say that technically that verse could be a lot more literal than people have translated it in the past. That it wasn't that they were free of sin; it was that their genetics was not. There were no giant genes in that. Yeah. So what do you agree with that, or what?
So that idea has probably come from a passage in Enoch that talks about the Nephilim, these beings, or the sons of God, even sinning against all the beasts of the earth, the reptiles and whatnot. And the theory that people have come up with is that they were performing genetic, manipulations and whatnot. And if beings outside of this earth could breed with beings in this earth and give birth to creatures, then can we manipulate the genetics of animals and people and mix,
hybrids,
all these sorts of things. And so what you're suggesting is that people say Noah was a pure human, basically, that everyone else out there had been bred and inbred and bred with this thing and bred with that thing, and no one is purely human anymore.
Yeah, that had angel DNA or something.
Yeah,
among other things.
Yeah, so that's what some people say. I would actually suggest the text is a little more clear.
Okay.
When it comes to what it's actually referring to. So,
which is?
Well, Genesis 6:9 says Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. And then 2 verses on, what Moses is doing here is contrasting Noah to the earth and to the inhabitants of the earth. So Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, in contrast to the earth, which was corrupt in God's sight. and filled with violence.
Yeah.
And previously in verse 5, he says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intention and the thought of his heart was only evil continually. But Noah, in contrast, found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So violence, wickedness, sin, evil thoughts, evil scheming, it's essentially almost what you see today. It's just...
Yeah, God should flood the earth again, because even I'm guilty of, like, I'm a sinner.
Yeah, so he's contrasting Noah with the earth and the inhabitants of the earth. It's a completely godless world. There's not much of an indication there that it's about genetics.
Okay.
I don't think Moses is talking about genetics, which is why Peter gets his information about Noah, obviously from Scripture. Peter refers to Noah as a herald of righteousness. Hebrews talks about Noah as a man of faith in God. So they're not using the sort of terms about being genetically pure and whatnot. So I wouldn't go there, just because I don't think the text is going there. I think it has more of a... It's talking more about his standing before God. And I think the fact that the story goes on to say Noah comes out of the ark, and they just record this little portion of Noah planting a vineyard and growing grapes, making wine, and then passing out drunk. And you're like, why did they include that? And there are other reasons, about Canaan and the curse that God put on Canaan as a consequence of it. But
that's this. I don't think I added that in my questions because I felt like it was too controversial.
Okay, but
you can.
But the point is, Noah's still not a perfect man.
No, of course not.
The whole point of the Old Testament is there's all these hero figures popping up, and the question is, from the very beginning, Adam and Eve sin. Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. God promises one of your children are going to come and they're going to undo what you and the snake did in getting expelled from the garden. So the entire Old Testament is filled with all these characters popping up, and you read it going, is this the character that's going to undo the curse, undo what the snake did, undo being expelled from God's presence and bring us back to God's presence? So you have all these heroes through the Old Testament, and all of them fail. All of them fail. Even the best of them fail. David fails miserably. He commits adultery, murders a man. And you're like, how could you do that, David? But the point is, we need someone greater than Noah. We need someone greater than Moses. We need someone greater than David.
We need Christ.
It's all pointing towards a greater Noah to deliver the people from the judgment of God that's coming on the earth, a greater Moses to instruct us how to live, and a greater David to deliver us and to save us and to bring us into the promised land. That's what the whole point of the Old Testament is. It's leading up to, it's pointing towards Christ. So I think the story of Noah has to do with Noah in contrast to the evil of the earth, but keeping in mind that Noah is not our deliverer ultimately, and that there is a greater Noah who's building not an ark but a church, and everybody in that church is going to be spared from the wrath that's to come.
That's a nice analogy. I didn't think of that. That's very nice. You're full of lovely thoughts. Some may say homophobic thoughts, but I say lovely. All right. Someone asked in the comment section, and I think it's a good question. Kenji, who I've been trying to get on my channel for ages, but the guy keeps dodging. He wants to know what you think about the gap theory of creation.
Well, that's another thing.
Which I didn't ask you. I know you haven't had time to research that question, but basically verses 1 and 2, that there's apparently a huge gap of time. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I'll just pull the verse up. So the idea is that Genesis 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So the idea is that within that little section, there could be millions of years of time. So God creates the earth millions or billions of years ago. There's this big cosmic struggle. This is maybe where Satan is expelled and the angels are expelled from God's presence.
I would say so myself, yeah.
And then God eventually comes to this earth, which is just corrupted. He plants a garden, and he puts man in that garden, and he tells man to now populate the earth, spread over the earth, and fix the earth, basically.
See, God is for sex.
Hey? What was that?
I said God is for sex. I was just begging. Sorry, it was a bad joke.
Okay.
Populate the earth.
Right. Okay. I get it.
Sorry, it was a commandment. Anyway,
within the
sorry.
context of marriage.
I know it was a joke. Okay, never mind. Continue.
Okay. So that's the idea. Personally, I don't think there's enough there. Like I couldn't hold to it. I don't think many people do these days. But if we're looking at the Bible, looking at the text, there's just not enough there. You can put it in, you can force it in there, but
it doesn't make it true.
We want to. You always want to approach the Bible by making sure we're taking out what the author intended us to take out, and not putting in what we want to put in or what we think would fit better there. So I don't hold to the gap theory.
Neither do I. Okay, so the next question I asked you was, does the I feel like I already know the answer to this, but does the Bible advocate slavery? I just want to answer it first. I often hear prominent atheists, particularly Jacqueline Glenn, tweeting about that the Bible advocates for slavery, yet God frees the Jews from Egypt into the promised land. Yes, they took 40 years to get there, but if God advocated for slavery, why would he free the chosen people and help them escape from Egypt by the strong use of plagues to really shake up the people of Egypt and be like, wow, this God is true, this God is real? That is my answer to the question. Ben, how do you respond to if God advocates for slavery?
It depends on how we define slavery. When we think of slavery, a lot of people just think of what they've seen in films or what they've learnt in history class, which is basically the African slave trade.
That's what they think about, yeah.
Which was entirely based on stealing people.
And that's evil, yeah.
Kidnapping people, taking them from their home and forcing them to live somewhere else. That kind of slavery the Bible condemns. Exodus 21 verse 6 says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone who's found in possession of him shall be put to death. It's capital punishment for
Joseph's brothers did that.
Yeah, it's capital punishment for stealing a human and forcing him into slavery. And in the New Testament, 1 Timothy 1, Paul says that enslavers he describes them as ungodly, lawless, disobedient sinners.
Yeah.
People who enslave people, which is you take someone into captivity, into slavery. So in the Old Testament, it's condemned, and in the New Testament, it's condemned. But the New Testament does talk about slavery. Paul has instructions specifically for slaves. What we're looking at in the New Testament is slavery as defined by or instituted by the pagan Roman system. This is not something advocated by the New Testament. This is not something instituted by the New Testament. The fact that it's mentioned in the New Testament does not mean that it's being condoned.
No, of course not. But people say that, oh, this is mentioned in the Bible. Ah!
Yeah. The other point where they may go to, if they're a bit more well-read, is there is a form of slavery in the Old Testament that the Bible advocates.
Yes, but that works very differently, and I didn't mention that. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You have to work for several number of years to pay off a debt. Is that what you're going to say?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the law prohibits stealing people and kidnapping people and forcing them into slavery. But what it does say is that basically they didn't have the government assistance that we do today.
No.
So if you're homeless, if you're in debt, if you're starving, you got no food, you got no clothing, nowhere to live, you lose your job, there is the option, rather than dying on the street and begging or begging for food, you can sell yourself into slavery. You can say, I will work for you for a number of years. What comes with that is, yes, you're that person's slave, or it's like an employee-employer. We use the same basic language.
Is a better word servant?
You could use that as well, but But the point is, they would sell themselves to someone, to a master, and basically, I will serve you. I'll do what you need me to do around your house, your property, with your animals. They would get clothed, they would get housed, they would get fed, they would get looked after. Sometimes their whole families would be looked after. It was a way of ancient people looking after people who are vulnerable or in debt or at the point where they could be homeless. It was sort of a welfare sort of system as well, which is very different to going and taking someone and forcing them to serve you against their will.
Definitely a very different ballgame.
And not only that, it was for a time limit as well. They were told you can only do it for a certain amount of years, and then you have to let them go free. And oftentimes the slave has a good standing with his master, has come to love, the family that he's working for. He won't want to leave. He'll go, well, where am I going to go? I don't want to go and buy a house. I don't want to go and I don't have anywhere to move. I'll live here. You're feeding, clothing me, looking after me, protecting me and my family. I'll stay here, serve you, and rather live like that. So even though it said release them after a while, a lot of them didn't want to.
You're not wrong. Okay, well, that answers that question. Let's move on to rape, which is a horrible subject matter. But the Bible, many atheists have claimed that, that's a strong word, I don't know if I should be using it, but does the Bible advocate for rape?
No. So,
no, of course not.
Like we talked about earlier, the reason why Christians were so vocal during the same-sex marriage campaign isn't because Christians just hate gay people. They don't.
Of course not. I don't hate gay people.
No. And I'm sure we have friends who would identify that way. But
I think you and I have friends, and people know who we're friends with, who we're happy to associate with and love. So
yeah, and honestly, I didn't even know. I don't even care.
No, it's not important.
I don't even want to know. I don't care. But
I just like people on a human level. If they're nice to me, I'm nice to them. That's it. And
it's the same as what you don't hear Christians going out there going, "Oh, I'm not friends with anybody who fornicates." It's like it's sexual immorality. That's what the Bible is against. But
I'm not friends with anyone who lies. I'm not friends with anyone who steals.
Yeah.
Those are two things I've done in my childhood.
Yeah. But with this stuff, where the Bible stands is that any sort of sexuality outside of a heterosexual marriage, and I say heterosexual marriage because Genesis 2 defines marriage as the union of a man and a woman. A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's the definition of marriage in Genesis, which Jesus then echoes later on. Jesus' definition of marriage, Genesis 2 definition of marriage. That's why Christians objected to the redefinition of marriage, not because we're out there to, just to ruin the lives.
They're just ruining dictionary definitions.
Yeah, it's because the state didn't institute marriage, therefore they can't redefine marriage.
No. So while we're at it, why don't we change purple to green and green to purple?
Yeah. So it's a question of where do you get your definition of marriage? Christians get their definition of marriage by God, because God instituted marriage in the Garden of Eden.
Absolutely.
Jesus reaffirms that later on.
Did you say Jesus?
No.
Sorry. That's so funny.
I didn't.
It sounded like you said Jeebus.
That's blasphemy. You missed that. Anyway.
Sorry, keep going. I thought you said Jeebus for 3 seconds.
No. Yeah, so it's the same with rape or any other form of sexuality outside of marriage. That's the Christian definition. That's the biblical definition. That's how God defines it. I'm not going to try and change that definition. I'm not God. I'm not putting myself in that position. I'm just going to subscribe. I'm just going to subscribe to how God defined it.
So then, how have you divulged into this subject and not the rape?
Well, my point was any
Bringing it. No, I know. I was trying to bring it back.
sorry. Any sort of sexuality outside is immoral.
Absolutely.
Which would include rape.
Yes.
So there's no.
So that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to come up again later. The question.
Yeah, I guess I'll mention it later, but we could have done it all in that. Yeah, no. We'll do it separately then.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a question that many people say, many who are not necessarily anti-God, but sort of people who are not really sure, agnostics would probably say this. How could a loving God kill the firstborn children of a race of people he created? Now, obviously, I'm referring to Egypt again. So when God was trying to free his chosen people, the Jewish people, from Egypt, one of the plagues was to kill the firstborn of everyone who happened to be Egyptian, who didn't happen. And I know that many of the Egyptians ended up leaving with the Jews. So I know it wasn't like a racial attack or anything like that. But anyway, how do you answer that question?
Yeah, so when Moses was little, you remember, he was put in the basket.
Yeah.
Found by Pharaoh's granddaughter. Yeah. But the reason why is because the Egyptians were trying to cull the Israelites. They wanted to kill all the
Slaughter
males.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we see is sort of
Tit for tat.
what you did to God's chosen people, he then does to them. It was during the Passover that God came, and what he told the Israelites to do was to kill a lamb and to paint the blood of that lamb over the door. And when the angel of death comes in, when God comes in himself and sees that blood of that lamb over that door, he will then pass over that door and spare the firstborn son from death. What that is a parallel to what we're saying today as Christians, that there is going to come a day when the angel of death comes, when the destroyer comes. He will come, and anyone who's not covered in the blood of the lamb is going to be killed, is going to be put to death. What this is a shadow of the reality of the gospel.
It's an analogy.
Exactly, yeah. But there's two misconceptions when people object to it. First of all, people don't understand the holiness of God and what it means for God to be holy.
Well, the people who comment on God don't know God, have no relationship with God, and only know the Bible through bits and pieces. So, anyway, sorry, yeah. I just thought I'd interject with that, but keep going.
No, you're right. The second thing that I don't understand is the sinfulness of sin and the sinfulness of humanity. The fact that none of us are born neutral. None of us are born with a blank slate. We're born into this world at enmity with God, opposed to God, from a young age. And the Bible actually says when the state we were in before we became saved or before we are Christians is quote unquote children of wrath, who are already condemned, whose the wrath of God already abides on them.
That's I don't know. Okay, so that troubles me because I just think about all the aborted fetuses and.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not saying at all that they deserve to be killed.
Yeah, that's why what you just said troubled me. Sorry, keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt. That just bothered me for a second.
No, go for it. But the point is that when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, all the children they had were outside of that garden.
Yes.
That garden represents a relationship with God, a communion with God. God is the source of life. Disconnect from the source of life, and death is inevitable. You're going to die.
Of course.
As I said earlier, the wages of sin is death. Death happens on this earth because of the spiritual disconnection between humans and God. When Adam and Eve had children, they were born in their own likeness, in Adam and Eve's likeness. Their likeness was now fallen. Their children were fallen, as we saw Cain killed Abel.
Were Adam and Eve Aryan? I'm just kidding. Keep
You've got
going.
many YouTube videos.
Just joking. They probably look more like me. They probably look Latin.
They I have no idea what I was talking about.
Sorry. So you said they had children that looked like them, but not in the Garden of Eden due to the sin. So Adam and Eve had sons and daughters, and they had Seth and an onslaught of other kids, and yeah.
Yeah. So the point is, if you read Genesis, like the sin just gets worse and worse and worse and worse, until you get to the flood and God destroys them. The point is, people are born in a state of sinfulness, and what that means, even though it's a baby, what that means is God still doesn't owe that human being anything. God is God. He doesn't owe anyone.
No, because we're being born with inherited sin.
Yeah, so even if God took a life, as hard as that would be for the parents, God doesn't owe you that life to begin with.
No, he doesn't. That's true. That's a good way to put it.
So what in the Garden of Eden, God said, don't eat of this fruit. If you eat of this fruit, you will die, which implies if you don't eat of it, you'll live forever.
Yes.
Once they ate of it, death became a certainty. They no longer had any claim to life.
They used to be vegans.
In the Garden of Eden, they could have said, I have not eaten of it. And they could have hold God to his word, because God's faithful to his word. The day you eat, you'll die. The day that I don't eat, I won't die.
Sorry, someone in the comments asked me if I'm still pro-Trump, and I was just showing them that I am. Right. And that's why I put that up.
I was racking my brain.
I am listening. I am listening to you.
Yeah. No, go. So we've already disconnected from God. We've already forfeited the blessings of God. So to say that God now somehow owes us something, owes us life, owes us blessing, is completely to misunderstand, to not understand his holiness, not understand our sin, not understand the effects of the fall.
Yeah.
The marvel in all of this is not the fact that some people die, or all die, but some people die seemingly prematurely, but it's the fact that we're still breathing today. That even though we've forfeited any claim to any blessings of God's because of our sin, we still are here today, breathing and experiencing the blessings of life. That reflects the grace of God every single day in our life. Every time that we're not experiencing what we deserve, which is his, complete separation from the holy God. Any day that we're not experiencing justice in that regard, we should be grateful and attribute to his grace and his mercy, which most people take for granted. But it's the false religions that reject that idea, and the false religions, all of them, will basically say, no, we're still in the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, God said, do this and you'll live. How do you sum up every false religion? Do this and you'll live. They differ on what they've got to do, but they essentially say the same thing. Do such and such a thing and you'll live. Christianity says, no, we've already violated that covenant. We've already broken that covenant with God. All we have now to hope on is God's kindness and his grace, which he showed for us in sending his son to live the life that we failed to live, and then to die the death that we all deserve to die.
Exactly right. That's perfect. What about the next question about Jericho? Now, for those who are not really particularly familiar with the Bible, you probably don't know much about Jericho, but my question is, why does God instruct war to occur between his chosen people and the people of Jericho? Essentially, what I'm saying is, why is God saying it's okay for the Jewish people to war against non-Jews? Because to me, it seems if he created Adam and Eve, then he's created all of humanity. So why is he causing war between family? How do you respond?
Yeah, so it's similar to what we just said in that previous question, which is God is the one who gives life and he's the one who can take it away. Sometimes God will do that himself. He will use his own power to take a person's life away. Sometimes he'll use instruments. He may he may use an animal. He may use, stones from heaven, or it's fire and sulfur, like he did with Sodom and Gomorrah. Sometimes he used the Israelites to do that as well, to bring punishment upon other people as well. These were godless people. We're not talking about nice, friendly little towns, little
So this was the
villages.
leftists of that time. How's that analogy?
No comment. but,
You laughed. You agree. Keep going.
but God did use instruments and command them to go and do these things and carry them out. What we can't do is object on any moral grounds. What moral grounds do we have to say God
To
can't
tell God what to do?
Yeah, any sense of justice that we have, we were given by God. So to assume that we have a higher standing of right and wrong, and to know who's deserving of life and who isn't over him, is the height of arrogance. So there's no solution in trying to hold God to a higher moral ground, higher moral standard than his own.
He is the standard.
Absolutely. What is good and what is right is that which conforms to his character. What reflects him is good. What misrepresents him is bad. So there's nothing outside of that you can judge him by.
No. Okay, so the next question is similar to what we were talking about earlier. So this is the question: why does a woman who is violated have to then marry her violator, her rapist? Because that's what used to happen in the Old Testament. What is your response to that?
Yeah. So
my answer is that I think it was a cultural thing of the time. But what is your response?
It's not necessarily the case.
Okay.
The command is, if a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, and the man who lay with her, then the man who lay with her shall give the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her, and he may not divorce her all his days. Now, that was not the punishment in every case of rape. In the verses just before that, in the verses just before, it says, if a man rapes a woman who is engaged or married, he shall be put to death. But here we have, if a man rapes a virgin who is not engaged or married, he shall be made to marry her. So the question is, why is there a difference? Why do they seem to get justice if they're married or engaged, but it seems to be an injustice if they're a virgin and they're not engaged? And the answer is not that God is being merciful to the rapist. The answer is that God is being merciful to the victim.
How so?
I'll explain. In Israel, virginity was highly prized to the point where women who had lost their virginity would have trouble marrying men. It's more likely that they would live alone for the rest of their life, have no children for the rest of their life, and not have the protection and the provisions in that culture that a man would provide for a wife. So this was a way of saying to the potential rapist, if you take a girl's virginity, you are then responsible for her for the rest of her life. That's why he says you cannot divorce her ever. For the rest
But what if she's not in love with the guy? And what if he doesn't like her?
Yeah, I'll get to that. But
okay, sorry.
No, you're right. So,
women's rights. Yeah.
No, so the point is, to the rapist, you rape a married woman or someone who's engaged to a man already, you will be put to death. You rape a virgin who you've ruined her life and potentially made her live on her own without the protection, without provision for the rest of her life, which is a miserable existence for a woman back then. You now have to bear the responsibility of providing for her, of clothing her, feeding her, looking after her, being to her the husband that you robbed her of. So it wasn't a mercy on the rapist. It was a punishment for the rapist, and it was a mercy on the victim. Now, obviously, that's horrific. You know,
Of course.
if it's some violent man rapes you, why would you even want to go near him? Again.
Well, maybe she likes S&M.
Anyway, the other condition is that the father has to agree. So it's up to the father, and you can imagine what father would
want his
allow.
daughter to be alone and a pariah.
And there's no instance in the Old Testament of this actually happening. So it's more of a deterrent for the rapist, or whatever the situation would have been. It's more of a deterrent that if you take this from that woman, she's going to be your responsibility for the rest of your life. You will care for her. The only reason you're not dead is to make sure she lives well. That's the point. The only reason we're not killing you is so that you can look after your victim for the rest of your life. And of course, Exodus 22, 16, 17, the father can refuse, but the man still has to pay the fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's not that bad then. Like, the way they make it sound, it's like, how horrible is God for allowing this?
Well, the same passage. You
just need context.
Verses just before, they're put to death. They're killed for it.
Yeah.
So the only reason that they're not killed in this instance isn't because raping a virgin is less of a crime or less of a sin. It's because now that you've done this woman is going to have a hard life. You're going to live the rest of your life looking after her, providing for her, protecting her, and taking care of her.
Yeah.
So as horrible as that would be for a woman, the father at least can step in and say, absolutely not.
Definitely. Yeah. The next question is, why did man live longer back then? So basically, for those who are not aware, in terms of biblical facts, people used to live to like almost 900 years of age back in the old times. Adam lived for about 900 years. Methuselah lived for 900 and I
think.
What was it?
969, I think.
Yeah, it was. It was a big number. But throughout time, the age has, like, most people live now to 70 to 100, whereas back then people could live to almost 1,000 years of age. So it's just unusual why that disintegrated so much. Like almost 1,000 years is completely different to 70 years to 110 years. Like it seems like man back then got to experience more out of life, and man today gets a lot less. It just seems a little unfair. What are your thoughts? What is your answer?
Well, we don't really know because the Bible doesn't really say.
It doesn't. It's very ambiguous.
But the two main guesses that scholars have is that there was atmospheric changes, that somehow the atmosphere back then preserved life longer and helped them to live longer. The other, which is I think more likely, the closer you are to Adam, the first perfect original human being, the less genetic defects and the less mutations you have. So to come from something that's pure, Adam and Eve, and then over time to have mutations and defects, all as a result of sin and the curse and death, they just amplify through the generations.
That's a very good answer.
I think that's more likely the case. But
I've actually never heard that. You're the first person I've heard say that. That's really smart. I'm surprised I never thought of it. Well, I'm not that surprised. But usually people say it's because God was punishing man bit by bit, and God was saying, no, you're not blessed with that amount of life. That's usually what I've heard. So you're the first person to say the DNA side of it. That's actually really clever. I think that's true. I think you're right.
There's a verse in Genesis, Genesis 6, verse 3, that says, when God's speaking about the Nephilim and the sons of God, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years.
Yes.
some people have read that to mean that God's put a limit on the age of people to 120 years, and
That's what I thought.
no one will ever live over 120 years. I think it's more likely 120 years, I'm going to flood the earth. 120 years, Noah has to build the ark. I think that seems more likely than putting an age, because people have lived over 120 years. So
yeah. Kenji in the chat said that he was taught at church that it was the firmament being destroyed at the flood.
Yeah. So that's like the atmosphere that I was talking about. So the idea is that there's this canopy of water over the earth that sort of protected the world from radiation and whatnot coming in from space, and just kind of was a protective bubble over the earth. But when the flood came, the Bible says the heavens were open. So people say that canopy of water broke, flooded the earth, and then we no longer have that protective outer water layer around the earth. So whether that's the case, I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. It just doesn't say, so it's hard.
No, it doesn't. All right. Next question. We're almost done. Is homosexuality the same sin as obesity and eating shellfish? Many non-Christians say, oh, well, you can't braid your hair and you're not allowed to eat shellfish, and you obesity, like a lot of these sins are considered the same in terms of severity. How do you respond?
Yeah, so this would go back to
what we were saying before. Yeah.
What was that, like the first or second question?
The first and second question. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's how do you deal with verses in the Old Testament that were given to other people, other than the New Testament Gentile church, which exists after Christ. The reason why Christians aren't, strict on shellfish and all those other commands, wearing clothes with 2 different fabrics and whatnot, eating bacon, is because they were, as I said, commands given to specific people at a specific time, which was before Christ, which was the nation of Israel, for that period. We don't then take those commands and apply them to our life today, because they weren't given to us any more than Noah's commands were given to us. So why then do people care about sexual immorality, for example, homosexuality or heterosexual immorality as well? Why do we care about that? The answer to that is because the New Testament deals with foods we can eat and foods we can't eat, and it says we can now, in the New Covenant, eat anything we want.
Yeah.
It does not say that sexual immorality is no longer an issue. Countless times in the New Testament, the apostles Jesus talks about sexual immorality, and it's sexual immorality as defined by the Jewish law. The law that the Jews had at that time. That's how they defined sexual immorality. So when Jesus just threw out statements about sexual immorality, that's exactly what he was referring to, and that's exactly what his hearers would have had in mind. Sexual immorality as defined by Moses, which included adultery, which included homosexuality. And you remember the woman caught in adultery was brought to Jesus, and they wanted to stone her, which was the punishment for adultery in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, Jesus says, well, whoever's without sin, throw the first stone. And that's the attitude that we see throughout the New Testament. In the New Covenant, it's not that God lowers his standard, but we're no longer living under we're not living under the civil laws that God gave to the nation of Israel pre-Christ. That's not to say, as I said, that God's lowered his standard of sin. If anything, he's upped it. Jesus in Matthew 5 says, if you look at a woman with lust, you're an adulterer in your heart.
Oh, absolutely.
If you hate someone, you've murdered them in your heart. So people look at the New Testament and say, oh, this is the gentle Jesus who's lowered the standards of morality. Whereas in the Old Testament, it was all just death. You get the death sentence if you do this or do that. But Jesus upped it and said, no, you're guilty of those sins if you commit those crimes. But because we're not a state, because Christianity is global, it's not a state with a civil government. How do we interact with the world? Christians can't just go around the world killing people who sin, like it was supposed to be in Israel, where they had a government and they had a civil law code, and the law code was given by God.
But murder, being a murderer means to hate someone with all your heart, and unfortunately, that's by that logic, I've known this for years, that makes me a murderer because I've hated people. I try not to anymore. I'm trying really hard not to hate people, even though they make it very difficult. But I don't think people are aware of that. Sorry, I know I'm divulging a little bit from the subject, but I think it's important for people to know that if you hate someone, you're technically considered that is murder under the eyes of God. When I'm angry at someone, at the moment everyone's making a big deal out of a particular video I just made where I'm angry at someone, but I don't hate them. I'm just angry at them. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is Jesus' attitude towards Sodom and Gomorrah. He made some comments in the Gospels. Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed because of their homosexuality. People have tried to get around that and pretend, no, it's about something else. It's about they just weren't kind to their guests. They weren't hospitable. If you read the text,
do they say that they weren't hospitable?
Yeah, that's quite common. So they all want to avoid it because they want to pander to the political issues of the day.
You can't change the Bible, guys. My gosh.
But what's important to remember is that Jesus said, on the day of judgment, it's going to be more bearable for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah than for the people who reject the gospel. Because the information that we have today about Jesus and about what God has done to reconcile humans to himself, that is a greater understanding of truth, that is a greater exposure to truth and to God than Sodom and Gomorrah and the inhabitants there could even have dreamed about. So God's going to hold us to a standard in relation to the knowledge that we have and the knowledge that we reject. The more light you have, the more knowledge you have of Christ, the more severe the punishment will be. So when it comes to issues like obesity or homosexuality or whatever, they're really just symptoms. All immorality, all sin is a symptom of a greater sin, which is a rejection of Christ, which is a rejection of the gospel. We sin because we're not believing the promises of God. When the Bible talks about faith, it's not faith that God exists, because the Bible says everybody knows God exists. It's faith that God's promises are reliable. So throughout the Old Testament is God making a promise and fulfilling that promise, making a promise, fulfilling that promise. The point is God keeps his promises. In the New Testament, we have promises that we have sin every day promising us pleasure. We commit sins because they promise us pleasure. Do this and you'll be happy. Steal that.
Temporary pleasures.
Exactly. They last for a season, but they don't promise that. That's why we have addictions, because they say, do this and you'll be happy. We do it and it lets us down. So we do it again and it lets us down. It can't satisfy. The promises of the gospel are that there is satisfaction in Christ, and at the resurrection, when we see him, all of our desires, all of our longings, everything that we need in life will be satisfied because we were made for him. And all the emptiness that we have in our lives today is because of our disconnection from him. We were made for him. Only he can satisfy us. Only he can make us whole. That's what the Christian is called to believe, that Christ came into this world, lived the life that we should have lived, died the death we should have died, and rose from the dead, defeating death. And if we trust in him, then we will die in such a way where we do not die forever, where we do not stay dead. He will bring us back. Just as he came out of the grave, we come out of the grave. That's the promises that the Bible tells us to believe in. Not that God exists. Satan knows God exists. He's not any more saved than the atheist.
No.
So We believe the promises of God, but those promises are held in contrast to the promises of sin. That's why the Bible says you'll know those who are born of God and those who aren't based on their attitude towards sin. Those who continue in sin, continue a life of sin, pursue sin, they're not born of God. 1 John 3 says, because they're believing the lies of sin. They're not believing the truth of Christ and his promises. I don't know how we got there, but yep.
Yeah, sorry, we always divulge. We're basically done. We have 2 left. This is one of my favorites as well. This is because, I don't know, I seem to really like things that sometimes lead people into conspiracy theories, but this one is, was Adam really the first man? And if that is the case, who was Cain afraid of? Because the first chapter of Genesis is quite different to the second chapter of Genesis. The sequence is completely different. It seems that the Bible is saying that God created man, and that then eventually he created Adam as the first man for Eden. How do you translate that?
Well, I definitely wouldn't say that is the case.
No. Okay.
But Acts 17 verse 26 says it quite clearly. God made from one man, Adam, every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. So he's saying every human being that exists today originates from one human being that God made.
So who was Cain afraid of when he was expelled?
Yeah, so Cain kills Abel.
Yes.
God kicks. So Adam and Eve sin, they get kicked out of the garden. Cain sins, he then gets kicked out even further. So it's showing people are getting worse, human beings are getting worse, and they're getting driven even further away from God's presence. So it's this downward trajectory that we're seeing.
Which beings was he afraid of?
Yeah, so I'll just give you context. But
sorry.
In case people aren't familiar with the story. Then he says to God, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me shall kill me. And so that's what you're asking. Who's going to find him and who's going to kill him? When we read the story of Genesis, we hear about Cain, we hear about Abel, we hear about Seth.
Yes. We don't hear about all the sisters.
They're the children of Adam and Eve.
Yes.
So a similar question that people ask is, where did Cain get his wife?
Yes.
If Adam and Eve had Cain, Abel, and Seth,
yes,
where's the women? Well, there's one verse that people often overlook in Genesis 5, verse 4, which says, the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800, and he had other sons and daughters. So
I knew that. I knew that they had daughters.
Yeah, we don't know how many children Adam and Eve had.
Yeah.
But the fact that Cain is fearful that there's the possibility that someone out there would find him and kill him, isn't that unbelievable when you realize that Adam and Eve didn't just have Cain and Abel and Seth, they had other sons and daughters too. Who knows how many? And considering the length of their years, the time they lived, it would have been very easy to establish a large crowd of people.
Yeah, he could have ended up marrying a niece or something, or another sister.
So Adam was 800. So how many children he had during that time, and how many children they had, Seth had, and Seth's children, and Cain, it could have been quite a lot. So it is entirely believable that Cain was afraid that someone related to him would take vengeance for what he did to their uncle, what he did to their brother, what he did to their grandfather. We don't know.
Yeah, well, because I saw this, I'd never actually heard this theory up until recently. I saw it just comes up on my YouTube recommendations, and it was Adam wasn't really the first man, and it was the 1970s. It wasn't even a brand new thing. It was an audio taken from some old guy in America who said, "Oh, well, I'll tell you this. Like, listen to the first chapter, listen to the second chapter, and you tell me." And then he lists these really interesting questions, and I'm like, I'm not going to be closed-minded to this. I'm going to actually listen to it and see if there's a possibility that it's true. And so he somewhat convinced me, but I always go back and forth on this. I never actually really know. And then one of the other things he raised was all the different races. Like you have Aboriginal people who are Melanesian. That's not the same as African people. And then you have Polynesian people who are like Cook Islander. That's different again. And then you have white people. You have Middle Eastern people. All of these are very distinctive looking different people. And I know most people say the Tower of Babel, but it makes more sense that it would have originated at the start. But anyway.
Well, race isn't really a Christian concept. Anyway.
That sounds very globalist.
No, not necessarily. Race is more of a evolutionary sort of idea. We don't break people up into races. There's one human race. There's one race. It's the human race.
Oh, of course. We're
they're divided.
God's image.
Yeah, where they're separated is in ethnic groups or family groups.
Of course.
It's very similar to, you see it in a micro sort of way with family members when you have a brother who looks different to another brother but has children that look like him, and he has children that look like him, and it's those predominant genes and features and whatnot passing on to the next generation and even amplifying over time. Like it's not really something that's necessarily dependent on God made Adam one color and then he made Greg a different color and then Brian another color. It's entirely possible. We see it in the way that different people, even in our own ethnic groups, look a certain way.
True. The last question is about humans and dinosaurs walking side by side. What did I ask? Did dinosaurs and man walk side by side? My answer to that question is yes, because the Bible talks about the Leviathan and Behemoth, and these are known to be some form of dinosaur. But did you want to elaborate? Because I know you've probably done more research on it.
Well, I think if you're reading Genesis 1 and 2, and the Bible is your standard for truth, we can't go back there and look. We can only take what God has revealed to us as truth. Then God made man and beast on the sixth day. They existed together, every animal, every beast. God looked at the earth when he'd made it, and he said it's very good. If you want to say that before Adam was created, there were millions of years of death, decay, disease, brutality, and that Adam and Eve are existing in this very good world on top of the corpses of the animal kingdom that went before them, how God, a good God, could look at that and say, this is very good, it's not a possibility. God looked at the world and said, it's very good because it had life and it had goodness and it did not have death. So yes, they existed with man because God, it says God made them on the same day he made man. There are mentions, as you said, there are mentions in Job about creatures. They don't call them dinosaurs, but they had their own term.
No, they don't call them dinosaurs. No.
Yeah, so which is a more modern term, but but they talk about creatures with these tails like cedar trees and iron legs and whatnot, which no animal in our animal kingdom could fit.
Like a brontosaurus.
Exactly. Yeah, so people say, oh, it's an elephant, but elephants don't have cedar tree tails.
No.
So that's a bit of a cop-out. But historically as well, ancient civilizations have multiple stories and depictions of dinosaurs and dragons in their history. So it's it's not as unbelievable as people think. Some say even stories of dragons in England and whatnot are just really exaggerated tales of just interacting
Dinosaurs.
with dinosaur type things, which isn't
Yeah.
that weird. You got the crocodile. It could,
Even
very easily.
The late Steve Irwin used to say that crocodiles and alligators were part of the dinosaur kingdom.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
a commonly known fact. So when people say, "Oh, how stupid are Christians?" they think that dinosaurs walked alongside humans. Well, I mean, we still do.
And if you ask most of them where they get their information about dinosaurs from, it's probably Jurassic Park. So
Yeah.
it's likely they're not the greatest experts when it comes to that
No.
sort of thing. But because so much of our thinking has been framed on by movies,
Yeah. And
how
corrupt
could they
institutions.
live with dinosaurs when the T-Rex is out to get you and whatnot? But it's likely they were very different to how they depict, just as Jaws depicts sharks very different to how they are in reality. I still don't like swimming in the beach though. So.
Fair enough. Well, they actually, slight tangent, they do say, well, I don't know how much research you've done on this, but as I said to you before, I've fallen down the rabbit hole of angels and humans having sex and the giants and all that stuff. That's very fascinating to me. I'm obsessed with it. But a lot of the experts, one of them who I managed to get on my channel, which is incredible, say that it's very possible that the 7 angels that came down, no, the 200 angels that came down and did what they did to the humans, that many of them were creating and putting together hybrids and animals that shouldn't have gone together, and that explains T-Rexes. And because a T-Rex is completely aggressive and volatile and so different. Like when God says that everything he saw he made was good, it was good. A T-Rex isn't good. He's just destruction.
I've heard that as well. I don't.
Oh, you have heard that? Okay.
Yeah. No, I have heard that they say the dinosaur or the fossils from the dinosaurs are the.
It's interesting, right? We should do a whole live stream on this one day.
It's interesting, but I don't. Yeah.
Fair enough.
I'm always a little bit skeptical, but
I'm skeptical. I don't
Yeah.
believe it with all my heart, but I'm really into it.
Yeah. No, I do too. I've watched way too many conspiracy theories.
That's funny. I'm not going to add the word conspiracy theory to the tags, that's for sure, because YouTube has gone funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're done. We've answered every single question that I had intended. Did you want to say anything?
No, I think I've said enough. I think people are sick of hearing me.
Okay. Well, I'll just go off the live, but just before I go off the live broadcast, just to let everyone know, thank you for tuning in. To all the people who hate me and were writing mean things in the comments, I love you very much. And next week, my guest is Johnny Moore. Many of you know Johnny Moore. He's often ridiculed by the leftists, but I'm having him on. He's young, he's idealistic. I want to get to know him. So next week, my guest for the show is Johnny Moore, but I think it'll be at 9 p.m. rather than 7:30 because that's when he finishes work. All right, thanks guys for tuning in. And be sure to go to cauldronpool.com. The link is in the description box below. Ben has an extremely successful website and it's worth having a look. All right. Bye, guys. Say bye, Ben.
See ya.
All right, hang on.